The brand new Sorcerer and Chain Lightning buffs are unbelievable and miraculous. Initially on paper, it looked like we were merely getting a straight up damage, mana regeneration, and survivability buff. And while this numerical tuning is significant in and of itself, their real significance is that what was previously impossible in terms of mechanics and skill choices and synergies and aspect choices and even playstyles are now made possible with these changes, which is quite literally a chain of buffs, no pun intended, that make the build take off in completely new ways. And for just one of the many examples, the recharging aspect was buffed so much that you can literally maintain infinite mana or even full mana with the right setups, which in turn greatly increases your DPS by allowing you to not only spam Chain Lightning as much as you want, but also allow you to synergize with Elementalist aspect, allowing you to maintain constant up to 40% critical strike chance, which is absolutely insane also because of the multiple critical strike synergies that Lightning Sorcerers happen to have. And that's not even all, because this constant spamming of Chain Lightning will also allow you to take the Frozen Orb Enchantment, which whenever you cast a non-basic skill, again being Chain Lightning, you have a chance to launch a Frozen Orb, which if you spec into Greater Frozen Orb, also has a chance to make enemies vulnerable, aside from your regular Frost Novas. And we're still not done, because by specking into Frozen Orb and having that extra vulnerable source, you no longer have to take Frost Blitz aspect for the extra Frost Nova charge, although you still could if you wanted to, but now you actually have the option to go with an alternative such as the brand new Mage Lord's aspect, which is also my personal preference, and which will also make you extremely tanky. And with that, a complete build guide will be linked in the description box below. And let's now take a look at the skill tree, gear, aspects, and all that good stuff to really see how the build functions. So starting off, for the basic skill, you just want to take Firebolt. I like to put 2 points here, but it really doesn't matter, as you won't be using any basic skills. The Firebolt here is just to use as the enchantment slot for you to be able to burn enemies with any of your attacks, namely Chain Lightning, to then synergize with all your burning passives. Next, you obviously want to max out Chain Lightning, with this being a Chain Lightning build, and then go into Greater Chain Lightning, which was greatly buffed, no pun intended, with the recent patch, allowing you to bounce up to extremely high amounts of damage. You also want to take the Devastation passive and max out Elemental Dominance here for extra damage, and I personally like to take Frozen Orb for the enchantment slot, although there are other alternatives which I will discuss later. But using this as an enchantment slot and giving you yet another source of vulnerable aside from your Frost Nova, I really feel like is quite valuable, and I just really like the aesthetic personally of the Frozen Orb spell. But if you don't want to take Frozen Orb for your enchantment slot, you essentially free up 3 extra points which you can put into anything you prefer really, such as the Flame Shield enhancements or extra points in Teleport. And speaking of which, for your defensive skills, you're going for the standard quadfecta, so to speak, being Flame Shield, as well as Teleport with Shimmering Teleport. I like 1 point into Ice Barrier, and then I also max Frost Nova and go into Mystical Frost Nova, of course, for the vulnerable. For Flame Shield, I only take the first upgrade, which increases your movement speed while it's active. And then, although I'm not showing it here, you also want to put points into the passives of the defensive branch, namely, of course, Glass Cannon you want to max out, like most sorcerer builds, and then 2 more points into the other passive, which on a lucky hit with a critical strike, which again this build will have plenty of, will actually be able to reset your defensive skills, which is extremely useful too. Next, on the Conjuration tree, you just want to max out the 2 defensive passives here. One of them that gives you damage reduction whenever you spend enough mana, and the other one that gives you an extra barrier aside from any ice armor that you already have whenever you cast a defensive skill. And then you also want to go into Precision Magic for some extra lucky hit. Moving over to the Mastery branch, I personally only have these invested into Devouring Blaze, which gives you a lot of extra damage from critical strikes. And again, since we're using Firebolt as an enchantment, you'll be able to burn enemies, which will allow you to gain this bonus. And moving over to the ultimates, I like Unstable Currents, as well as just Prime Unstable Currents without going further, because we're not using Crackling Energy. And even though we're not using the Overflowing Energy key passive here, Unstable Currents is still quite powerful of a cooldown for, say, larger elite packs and even boss fights. And then aside from that, for the passives here, I like Electrocution for extra tankiness because of the theme of this build, and I also prefer maxing out Convulsions for extra stunning, which will again help the survivability of this build, which is what I really like. And then for the key passive, Veer's Mastery is really good here. It allows you to be up close and personal and deal more damage up close, and this is also recently buffed, and this also synergizes with your critical strikes. Plus, it enables you to use the new Mage Lord's aspect, adding even more tankiness to the build. And for your enchantment slots really quick, again, I prefer Frozen Orb, but you can definitely go with Fireball if you want to do like speed farming specifically, or if you're just leveling up and want the extra AoE, which by the way, Fireball enchantment causes enemies to explode in a fireball whenever you kill them. So that's really good for those types of niches. And then the other one, you typically just want Fireball enchantment to be able to again benefit from the various burning synergies, like the reduced damage from burning enemies item affix, and also the increased critical strike damage you'll be getting from your skill tree. Aside from that, the Chain Lightning enchantment is pretty good as well if you don't want to take Frozen Orb for just pure extra damage. And even though I'm not highlighting it here, Teleport can be quite good too for replacing your evade with a teleport, which can be helpful especially if you have the Raiment of the Infinite, which groups in and stuns enemies. And moving over to gear really quick, what I'm showing you here by the way is nowhere near optimized, but I do have most if not all of the necessary aspects. Starting with my weapon, where I like to use the aspect of control for just extra damage to crowd controlled enemies, which also works especially well when you have Frozen Orb chilling enemies on top of your other CC. I like the accelerating aspect for increased attack speed, especially once you have the infinite mana status going on. This will work even better, and this will generally require you to get a higher roll on the recharging aspect, which I'm showing you here is the lowest roll, which by the way you can also pick up the aspect from the Zenith dungeon. So with just this roll and a little bit of mana cost reduction on my gear, I actually am not able to quite reach infinite mana spamming status just yet, but with a higher roll and a bit more mana cost reduction from your amulet as well as your offhand and even resource generation, basically the right combination of these, you will be able to have basically infinite mana and be also almost always topped off for you to benefit from the Elementalist aspect, which will grant you a ton of extra critical strike chance, which by the way, this is also obtainable from I believe a dungeon aspect, if not the season journey. But if you get a higher roll on this, you can get a massive boost to your critical strike chance, which will then also synergize with everything else with lightning crits from your skill tree and Paragon board. But again, constantly maintaining this will require you to keep your mana basically topped off. And if you don't yet have a great roll on the recharging aspect, there are other ways to regain mana, such as you take the legendary Paragon node Static Surge, which I recommend. Whenever you stun an enemy, you also gain mana. So once you spam enough Chain Lightnings, if you don't have the recharging aspect as high rolled, you can actually also use Teleport with the Raiment of the Infinite to stun enemies to regain some mana as well. And also with your skill tree, you also have some passive ways to stun enemies, so that should help a bit with mana regeneration too before you get your ultimate gear. And with that, coming back over to the rest of my gear, on my amulet, I like the Unbroken Tether aspect, which is also from the season journey, but it would be great to get a higher roll because this will allow your Chain Lightning to chain additional times, which will not only help with damage, but again also mana regeneration with the recharging aspect, which gives you again mana whenever it bounces. Next, for my helm, and for my first defensive aspect, I like the Mage Lord's aspect, which goes along with Veer's Mastery. And then for the chest armor, now I would actually prefer using Raiment, which I am currently using right now. But as of the recording of this specific clip, I haven't actually gotten the Raiment yet, but later on it did drop. But a great alternative to that would be the Ever-Living aspect, and I believe some hardcore players are actually using that over Raiment because it'll give you a third defensive aspect and just massive tankiness, which again especially works well with Frozen Orb, which chills enemies. Moving on over to my gloves, and I actually wanted to group all my offensive aspects together, but I guess I missed out my gloves, so here it is. I basically prefer the Conceited aspect, and again, all these offensive aspects can be used interchangeably on the pieces that support them, other than the amulet, right, which gives you a bonus, and I like the extra Chain Lightning bounces from that. But anyhow, here again, just flat out extra damage from a barrier, of which you have many, between your ice armor and also your passive barrier generation from casting any defensive skill. And onto my pants for the ultimate generic aspect, which don't get me wrong, is still extremely powerful, and we have Disobedience for the extra general armor. And last but not least, for my boots, and I also don't know why I didn't record it in my clip here, but anyhow, I'm currently using Asu's Heirloom for just a little bit more damage via critical strike chance. But Here you can really go with whatever you prefer. Some people like the movement speed aspects on their boots along with some mana cost reduction to help them achieve the infinite mana status. And by the way, you can also roll ranks of Frost Nova and Teleport on your boots to reduce their cooldown further, which can be extremely helpful too if you don't really want the extra damage. And really quickly, as for item affixes, it's pretty standard as well compared to a lot of other builds. Just keep in mind that Lightning specifically is able to roll its own version of critical strike damage, so essentially on any offensive piece of gear, you can roll both critical strike damage and lightning critical strike damage, and so you would want to prioritize as well because this build crits a heck of a lot. And then you can also go with some crit chance as well as attack speed on your gloves. Of course, ranks to Chain Lightning is actually the most important, which are also on your gloves. Vulnerable damage despite being nerfed is very good as well. And then you can also go with some mana cost reduction, again on your amulet, your helm, and maybe even your boots. Some resource generation could help as well, assuming you don't yet have that high of a roll on your recharging aspect just yet. And some other ones to quickly highlight are cooldown reduction, which is very helpful for your defensive skills, including your teleport. These standard defensive affixes are obviously very helpful, of which, by the way, sorcerers can actually also get the reduced damage from burning enemies, which if you take the Firebolt enchantment, which I recommend, you will be burning enemies and thus be able to benefit from that affix as well. And now onto some Malignant hearts. And by the way, I won't specifically be covering Paragon because it's really standard stuff, but if you want to check out the Paragon tree, of course you can just check out the build guide in the description box below. And if you have any questions, you can let me know too. But anyhow, for now I'm just going to talk about the Malignant hearts, starting with, for your Wrathful heart, the Black heart, you basically just want the Barber because it's just so powerful. And for your other ones, starting with the Brutal heart, I personally prefer the Heart of Revenge for some damage reduction, but there is another pretty good alternative, and I haven't really tested which one's actually better, and that's the Caged Heart of Spellbreaking, which actually grants much higher damage reduction than the Caged Heart of Revenge, but actually doesn't reduce damage from the first hit that triggers this effect, right? Although if you just can keep triggering it non-stop for however many seconds, such as 8 seconds here, it can actually provide even more damage reduction on top of or replacing the Heart of Revenge. Or if you want to use both, that's fine too. And for the other one, for the Vicious Heart, I would actually recommend the Caged Heart of Tempting Fate once you get the infinite mana status and be able to cap out your mana at really high and also gain that extra critical strike chance consistently. This Caged Heart will synergize with that and allow all of your critical strikes to deal extra damage while reducing damage of your non-crits. But before you get there, using the Caged Heart of Tal Rasha is just a pretty decent damage increase as well, and it's fairly easy to activate. And that is my tanky Chain Lightning build, which is just a breath of fresh air, especially as a sorcerer, being able to face tank monsters that are over 10 levels of my character's level fairly comfortably at that. And I'm only going to get stronger from here on out because my gear isn't even close to being optimized. So I'm really looking forward to the future, and also stay tuned for a future guide where I actually will try taking this character into the fields of hatred and into PvP to see how far I can actually push the limits of this build. And with that, again, the build guide is linked in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. Consider subscribing to my channel for more cutting edge guides. Also to my Twitch channel, which I will try to stream more of and have some spicy builds for you to check out. And with that, I will catch you in the next video. Peace.